wonderful that you're excited because this is a challenging topic to wrap your brain around. And in fact, you know that as I was getting into this, this whole question of me versus we in preparation for this, it got me into things like, so what is the pathway for this conversation that I might help to provide? You all, when we get into your conversation, can of course go wherever your own learning as an individual takes you. But I hope to provide some scaffolding. I quite literally, Daniel and I were on a plane. Yes, we took our first business trip together in 14 months. And yeah, I can tell you a lot about Daniel. Once again, I used to travel with him a lot, and now we did that. But we were getting back, and I told him, like, I have hated preparing for Friday. It's been not because I hate the content, but because it's unwieldy. So I will ask for, out of the gate, a lot of grace as I dig in and even just set the stage. So one of the things that it occurred to me is that while we will hint at some of this, I'll tell you what it won't be about. Is that there's a whole nother content area that we talk about often regarding me versus you. And what I mean by the versus is that when we're talking about paradoxes, we're talking about two competing realities, both of which are true. So it's not truly a versus, but in our reality, it feels like that oftentimes. And so what we're not going to talk about today, but I will hint at, because I think it's related, is how do I stay true to what's important to me and stay connected to what's important to you? And those of you that know me know that that is a fundamental reality that is very important to me. It's a conviction I have regarding leader development, because it's one thing to talk about our truth, and that's all fine and good. But as soon as you become a leader, or a leader that has any connective tissue whatsoever, you realize that your job is now to understand your own truth, but be connected into multiple truths of other people that may want different things. And to deny that would, and this is why I feel convicted about that, would be to deny the necessary preparation for those moments. Something that Daniel and I talk about also often is, what is your leadership idol? And what we mean is that different people have different things to sacrifice in order to serve well, to build up their own efficacy, or to connect to others. And some of us, there's different sacrifices that might be necessary. I know that prompted something in all of you. I shouldn't have even said that, because it's not where we're going today. So here's where we're going today. In this me versus we conversation is really, I'm going to come back to this, but one of the things we talk about often with WiLD leaders, and that all the tools we provide have been built under this fundamental premise of focusing on the one with an eye to the many. Focusing on the one with an eye to the many. And one of the reasons I need your permission to go some places, I'm going to talk about some things that are philosophical, some things scientific, even philosophy of science as we integrate the two just a bit, but also hopefully provide some practical applications of the way this is working out in our leadership world, and also just in our world in general. So one of the things that just happened is that, as I mentioned to you, Daniel and I just traveled together. And so I got to highlight this, because many of you have been part of the WiLD conversation in this community. We have not traveled together for work for 14 months. And so it was just weird to see him. I had seen him three-dimensionally more recently than 14 months ago, but to travel with him three-dimensionally is a whole different thing. And but we went out, and it was the first time that I had spoken on a stage, quite literally a stage. And so something occurred to me. It was a morning where we actually were doing an all-day workshop in a socially distant space that allowed for 50 people. But then having a moment midday to do a keynote in front of maybe 1,000 people. And so what was interesting was, I will tell you this, it was fascinating to watch Dr. Halleck. Some of you know him quite well. Everybody look at Daniel right now, make him super uncomfortable, because the thing about Daniel is, you know his heart and his spirit. But as soon as he walked out in front of those 50 leaders when we launched in the morning, he was coming out swinging for the fences. I'm telling you, I think I realized how much we had learned in a Zoom context, in a virtual context, and things that we've been convicted about in terms of the experience of leaders that I saw in real time coming out through him, which was kind of amazing to see that integration of this amazing experience that I would offer to you has offered us some real things that face-to-face does not sometimes. And so we come to lunch, and I first of all, when I walked into the room, I was like, okay, things are this is weird, like being in a room with hundreds of tables, in this whole process. But I'll tell you this, what was strange for me, and those of you who just public speaking in general. But, when you get in sort of that larger context, you walk up on a stage like that, and there were two huge spotlights in my face, which the only spotlights that are in my face right now are the box light that's facing me right now. And so I can see you all pretty well. If I'm looking at you there, I can see you there, and the camera's here. And so I kind of know this structure. So I walk up there, and the lights were so bright, I literally could not see anyone. It was so strange. And so I'm squinting they probably are thinking like, what is he doing? This is where like your reality of seeing someone is quite awkward, because in an audience, it's not very effective for a speaker. A speaker should not be calling out these weird things they're trying to do for themselves to see someone. You know what I mean? Like, I should just do my thing, but instead this is what I'm doing when I walked out there. Like, I know I was doing this. Like, I was just I could not see past the lights. And then I would catch a person's face. And I would, because I've become so, I actually get a little emotional when I describe this. I've become so used to being able to see you. Like, I can see Jim Gobelbecker right now, and he's waving at me. So like, I can see your faces. And it's so interesting, because what it prompted in me was this tension between seeing a person, looking at Jim and saying, so what's going on with Jim? And what's going on in his own journey and his own development, as an old friend of mine. So I couldn't see those people. And even if I don't know you right now, I might look at you and I make assumptions because I want to see you. And so it was an interesting tension between paying attention to the many people in that room and doing the best job as I could for them. But also, what I care about is that capacity to see people. And what I want to suggest is that that's challenging, and that it requires us, the same thing that I was trying to do in that moment is something that we might more effectively as leaders be working at all the time. And I'll explain more what I mean by that. Here's another example of this that just hit us on the way home. So we're flying for the first time, and usually flying is not an exciting adventure. It's like you do it enough and you're just like, get me off this plane. But it was like this time, Daniel and I are like, oh, there's new things to see. I'm looking out the window again. So we get back to Seattle and we're flying over the city. We're probably, I don't know, what was it, 3,000 to 5,000 feet, Daniel? And we're looking out the window, and it occurred to us, as you look out at that cityscape, it looks more like one of those train sets with a landscape around it. You know what I mean? Where you can see the rivers and the fake lakes, and you can see where the train's going to go into a tunnel 15 miles later. But what's interesting is stepping back to that level, and this is oversimplified, but in some ways, think about this at a sociological level. You can see large patterns of human behavior and the way that they map onto a world that, unless you're looking at it from that level, you don't really see. You can see the way that the cityscape of Seattle was built. You can see the grid of streets. You can see the neighborhoods that surround it. We even flew kind of near my home. I was like, Daniel, there's my house. I was that kid on the plane. But what's interesting is there's things that we know that we can't see in context. So for example, if we zoomed into one neighborhood or block, we would begin to see interactions between groups of people. If we could stand back high enough to see that, we would see interactions between groups of people. But there's still something else we wouldn't see. And what we wouldn't see is we wouldn't see the one. So it would take us actually moving right to the street and standing next to someone to look them in the face and say, Tim or Tamar, what's going on with you? And I think I say that because it's almost, and this is, again, it's an oversimplification of these definitions, but it's almost like a sociological level, coming down to looking at the group or the groups, the group of people, of individuals interacting is more of a social psychological level. And then getting actually to the one is something that I think I'm going to describe in just a moment. Our friends in clinical psychology have sometimes done a better job than I will admit this, than our friends in industrial organizational psychology, which is the guild that many of us come from. Not all of you, but at least I come from, and Daniel comes from. So it's one of the things that as we set this up, I want to mention one other thing that happened on this trip, because we had a leader at the end of the day that I think she is someone who we noticed, I think she was working hard at this capacity. So I want to suggest that one of our challenges this is why we asked that question of the forest of the trees, is that some of us have sort of a default way of seeing our world. Some of us actually are doing both. And like I mentioned in the chat, it's quite exhausting for me. I think it actually is tiring holding those things, but I'm naturally drawn sometimes to see individuals, and sometimes I step back. And the team that works with me knows that. WiLD Leaders, our WiLD Leaders team knows that I have that kind of craziness going on. but that it takes work. And so we were asking a leader questions, and her name was Cynthia. And Daniel asked her a question in front of the 50 leaders. She did not show she was going to be asked. And the question was this. So a slide went up that said, what would change if? And then it said, and then the next slide said, you were surrounded by cheerleaders, mentors, and people who give it to you straight. Okay. So her goal was, and Daniel said, just answer this question. The first thing that come to mind, it was a part of what 10 different questions Daniel was asking her. What would change if was one slide that disappeared. And then the second part shows up. You were surrounded by cheerleaders, mentors, and people who give it to you straight. Now I want to tell you that we at Daniel, we've had a lot of people answer that question and that series of questions. She did something I had never noticed before. It may have happened, but I don't even think it's happened. She answered the question regarding that you were surrounded by cheerleaders, mentors, and people who give it to you straight. And by the way, she paused and she was very thoughtful. And this was a very senior leader, very thoughtful. And then she did this. She said, but what would change if? And what was unique that I had never seen someone do actively was she remembered the prompt to take her somewhere deeper developmentally. And I had seen her do this 2 or 3 times during the day, because this was at the end of the day. And so, because she was going somewhere deeper, because she went back to the prompt that was not on the screen. And I went up to Cynthia at the end of this and I said, Cynthia, you have a unique leadership competence, I think, that you've either developed, I don't know where it's come from, but it's what people call in the sort of the executive competence space. It's an executive level skill called metacognition. Some of you have heard me talk about that before. And I said, it's the ability to think about your thinking. But it's also about this ability to step back and see all the things that are going on. And she, you know what she said? It was so fun to talk to her, because she said, I've talked to my husband about this for years, but I've never known what to call it. And I was just like, and it's an executive level functioning, because it was this point that thinking about your thinking is part of the leader's job. To do that, to step back and to see multiple levels of context and layers is so important. I want to read you a quote. And this is part of this point, but this is where I got to allow me to kind of go in different places. But as novelist David Foster Wallace once said, this is a great quote. I have been at the center of every experience I've ever had. I have been at the center of every experience I've ever had. Isn't that true of all of us? Without question, we are the primary player in our experience of our world, because we are. Being the center of every one of our experiences puts us at the center. A radically other-centered self, that is still a self, sees that both a focus on me and a focus on me as part of a larger community is necessary. And that paying attention to both your needs and my own needs requires work. Every experience, by default, is seen through our eyes and our lens. We alone truly know the depth of our pain, our victories, and our reaction in every moment of our lives. And we know that while we are at the center of every experience we have ever had. This is my reflection, by the way, on his quote. So I'm just reading this piece. While we know we are at the center of every experience we've ever had, others play just as critical a role as we do in that story. Even more, we aren't alone as we think. While our most hopeless moments may draw us into ourselves, it's in the moments when we realize that we are not the only ones that we move step by step closer to the wholeness we so deeply desire. Even in the most mechanical parts of our lives, like in the daily grind of our work and jobs. Hopefully your work and job is not a daily grind, but sometimes it is. The reality is that our shared humanity is always there if we were just to get outside of ourselves long enough to see it. If I were to finish that quote by David, this is what I wrote, by David Foster Wallace, I would go on to say, yes, I am at the center of every experience I've ever had, but you and I stand together at the center of every moment that has ever mattered in my life. Unless we have spent our life in a cloister, as Thomas Merton has described, our lives are experienced through our eyes, but live out in irreconcilable, wild, and wonderful relationships to others. And I think that's a question that will confront all of us somewhere in our journey at some point. And so I know that's kind of, there's a part of that was so poetic for me, the way he said that. You know, he goes on to say a lot more, but that we play a role with each other. And I think this way that we see our world, and even seeing individuals and understanding groups of individuals, and what science and what some of the things that are happening in culture might inform about this might be important. So let me just go a little bit more into this. I want to just make a couple of points. So there's oh man, this is so hard to describe. There is something it's described as a nomothetic versus an ideographic lens on your world. Some of you are going to know a lot more about this than me, is maybe you are philosophers and you are scientists who have studied this. But let me dig into this for just a moment. That a nomothetic approach would be to look at patterns across groups of people. So psychologists have spent a lot of time in this space of looking at patterns. So even if you look at any research on the psychology of a person, usually we're studying individuals to understand patterns that are common across those individuals. Are you with me? It's basically the foundation of all the scientific method. Okay, so if we're trying to solve COVID scientifically, we've got scientists who are using the exact same methodologies, by the way, that social scientists and psychologists use. And the nomothetic approach is this approach that says we need to look at these patterns across different people. And I would suggest to you that we do that all the time. We make generalizations about a group of people that aren't necessarily backed by science. And the question about science, my wife and I got in an interesting conversation last night about this, is like, the question becomes like, what do you trust in science? And I think anyone that says, well, science proves that, is probably not a scientist, because science it revolves around iterations of understanding as we begin to triangulate on truth. So we learn new things. Throughout the centuries we've done this. But what's interesting, so the other way of seeing your world would be through an ideographic lens. And I love this, the way that I bottom shelf this for myself, I bring this to the street level for myself, is think of idiosyncrasies. So an ideographic lens would say that the experience of the individual matters. That the experience of the individual matters. I don't know if I want to read this to you or not, because it kind of blew my brain apart, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. Tim Wenzel, are you ready to go? All right. This is an article someone wrote called, I can't remember the last part. It's a manifesto. Anybody that puts manifesto in the title of something is going to blow your brain. So just let me read this. And it's overstated. There's some stuff in there I'm like, but it is interesting. Coming at the end of this manifesto, this is what this author says: I would like to make a prediction about the future trajectory of psychology itself. And psychology is affecting all of us all the time, by the way, okay? Whether we like it or not. The total number of persons that will have lived on the earth before it becomes inhospitable to life, the author calls it heat death, is finite. For a modern physicist, this number is not really large. That's a whole nother conversation. Given the ongoing spectacular increases in computational capacity and facilities, and given also the expected increase in possibilities for online censoring, it can be predicted that in the near future, it will be possible to listen to this, continually assess and store the unfolding life history, trajectory in behavior space, I don't know what that means, of each individual. Added to this detailed knowledge of the genotype of each individual and other relevant background variables using recursive optimal control techniques. We all know what that is, right? It then becomes possible to personalize treatments. I was kidding about we all know what that is. In place and time. Here's the big finish. The more we approach this state of affairs, the more the power of the ideographic approach as described here will become evident. So in other words, okay, yeah, I'm looking at you tomorrow. Your brain's exploding right now. Here's my point. Think about it this way. Big business has figured this out. One of the most popular movements on college campuses or majors, because some of you know that, like I just left my university professorship after 25 years, last June 30th. One of the most hotly debated topics, or who's going to own it, is data analytics. Why? This is Rob's conviction about it. Because big businesses are doing a lot with data right now. Okay, so I think what's interesting about that is we have to think about, before we just pump out data analytics majors, is think about for the sake of whom or what. Like let's have people who are thinking about some of the realities of this. But here's what's interesting. In the past, you had to choose. There was a book called Blown to Bits that was written where you had to choose between richness and reach of a message. If I wanted to reach more people, I had to decrease the richness of that message. That's like newspaper time, right? Okay. Or if I wanted to reach or send out a rich message, I had to decrease the number of people I could send it to. Then, we kind of overcame that, and then I could send out a pretty rich message to a lot of people. That whole proposition has now been blown apart because now we are able to go ideographically and customize. So for a certain shoe, she gets certain kind of shoes popping up on her screen. Do you see where I'm going with this? So it's interesting. Businesses have figured this out. They have the capacity now to see the one to manipulate consumer behavior. And I think there's something to learn from that in our work in organizations. Because this is what's kind of, let me just read something that I wrote about this and as I was reflecting on that. What's the relevance of what large corporations are doing, or even what this author on the manifesto was talking about related to our capacity to see individuals? What's the relevance of that to our daily experience of ourselves in relationship to others? While companies have figured out that they must pay attention to both general trends in our buying behaviors, that's no, and make sure that the messages feel like they are directly catered to us as individuals, idiographic, they are using that information and capability to manipulate consumer behavior. And manipulates, maybe I don't want to be a negative word. It's just like, that's what marketing is about. While I hope none of us would be thinking of using that knowledge to manipulate others in our world, a constant awareness that we must see each person as an individual and as someone who shares some things in common with others is important. Again, the goal being to focus on the one with an eye to the many. Maybe one of the most responsible ways to do that is to accept that there are things we share in larger general categories that may look very different at the granular level, individual level. And I want to go on to say this. I do think might be some truth to this. The fundamental reason that many leader development solutions are seen as mediocre successes or even failures is that they are focused on the many and have lost the one. Because when we become responsible for larger and larger groups of people, we begin to look for systems that are not intentionally structured to allow an individual to be seen while also providing a system for the masses. And one simple example of that in our work at WiLD is that we have been asked over and over and over again by corporate kinds of contexts that the data be used for succession planning systems. And one of the reasons that Daniel and I and the rest of our team will say no is because what they mean is we want to look over the shoulder of a person who uses these tools for their development. Would any one of you deny that if your manager were looking over your shoulder, that your responses to a narrative question would change, or to any question? None of us would deny that. So it takes a paradigm shift to begin to say, I'm actually going to put development in your hands. And I'm not going to look over your shoulder. I might look at general trends in that data that might be okay if we protect the individual, but protecting that is so critical to us. That's why we say with the WiLD Toolkit users, we don't look at your data. We can help you get access to your account, but it's important that you know that it's your data. So I want to finish with this. I'm going to give you 5 handholds, and then we'll bust out there. One is this. This is a great way to think about this. I had a former doctoral student, Roble Kurse, good friend of mine, and he tattooed on his arm. Who does this? Okay, only PhD students or graduates in IO psychology would do this. He tattooed on his arm the regression equation. The regression equation, really oversimplified, stands for this. And his point was this: if you look for patterns in behavior, there are patterns to be found. Okay, if you look, there are things to see and understand and notice. That would be a nomothetic approach. Here's what was powerful about the equation on his arm. He included the error term. Mathematically speaking, he included an error term. And when I talked to him about it, I'm like, so you threw the error term on the end of the regression equation? He said, yeah, because that's grace. That is a reminder to see the one and understand our own error in seeing an individual and not making assumptions because of things about their group level that may be important for us to see, that we are radically focused on, can I see you? Can I see you? So here's a couple of things about that. Number one, pay attention to different levels of context. I think that's what we're working at. What does it mean for us to do that? And again, I'm editing in real time, so don't hear these as like, do that. See, this is like Rob looking in the mirror. Okay. Pay attention to different levels of context. Number two, offer grace to those working hard at multiple levels. I think it takes grace. We have to be willing to let people get into the messy and awkward space going between the one and standing up on the stage and trying to find people. Number three, hold group level data like a ball of yarn. A ball of yarn is still a ball of yarn, but we hold it this way so it's not tightly wound. Hold it like that. Number four, intentionally hunt for outliers or those who don't represent the face validity right in front of us. I think it's so interesting to look for the person standing back on the wall who feels like they don't fit. And then last one, focus on the one with an eye to the many. That's our WiLD saying. That's what we're all about. So I'm just super excited. Let's go talk.